my role as a decarbonization lead to make sure that the real experts, the engineers working on these projects daily, have the right tools and have the right processes and understanding in place so that they can work with design optimization. Within infrastructure, there's not so many certifications, and there are not so many certifications that exist, and it's not sought after by the asset owners. I think I, without a doubt, can say that it has been one of the more rewarding tasks I've had in my career.
Hello, you're listening to Sustainable Infrastructure, an Norris podcast where engineers, policymakers, and construction leaders share their experience on how they act for sustainable infrastructure. I'm Renaud de Montaignac, co-founder at Oris, and today I'm receiving Andreas Linnet, Senior Engineer and Global Decarbonization Lead for Infrastructure at Ramboll. Good afternoon, Andreas. Nice to receive you here. So can you introduce yourself quickly and what's your motivation regarding sustainable infrastructure?
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Renaud, and thank you very much for having me here today. As you said, my name is Andreas Linnet. I'm the Global Decarbonization Lead in Ramboll for infrastructure. That's close to 4,000 colleagues. So I think that my everyday work mostly revolves around infrastructure decarbonization. How do we move towards a zero decarbonization agenda here? But it's also about helping everyday project work, day-to-day project work. How do we progress that? How do we talk about decarbonization in general? I think that my general motivation here is to try and implement a change on every project that we work on moving forward. We can't save the world through a single project, but if we do a little bit extra on every project, we will move in the right direction, and that's definitely my motivation.
Yeah, excellent. One step at a time, certainly, and one project at a time. Can you maybe also explain or share what was the first steps for you into carbon and into decarbonization? How do you get into that field?
Well, I have now spent 11 and a half years in Ramboll. But before that, I think my first journey into the world of decarbonization started at university with a specialization within life cycle assessments, which I was fortunate enough to discover. I don't think it was planned. I kind of went through my university time picking whatever topics I felt most attached to. And then all of a sudden, I had an introduction course to life cycle assessment, and things just kind of clicked. And I like the way of thinking. I like the way when you solve a problem, you don't just solve the one right in front of you, where you make sure you don't create a new one along the line here, or down the path a little bit, if you will. So that kind of thinking really motivates me. I also think that I could see the possibility to influence decision making quite early, and that was definitely the start for me. And then I was lucky enough to work within the auto industry as a student helper, where we were trying to sell not only electric cars, but a solution for charging as well. And that again opened up some of these critical questions and thinking. Is it really a better solution? How do we compare one solution against another? How do we do it from a systematic point of view? I think that was very interesting, and I did some papers on that as well. Because if you can put down a scope on a specific issue, and if you scope it correctly, you can tell the story you want to tell, but it might not be the right way of comparing solutions. You need to have a fair understanding of the scopes and make sure that you can compare wherever it is that you're trying to compare, and you don't, for example, compare apples to oranges, which was my professor's favorite quote. And that just kind of stuck with me. So those two experiences together kind of formed my professional life, if you will.
And then when you joined Ramboll, was it immediately part of your job, or was it something that you brought in, or you were, I don't know, how does it happen?
I think that starting in Ramboll as a junior engineer 11 and a half years ago, I did not have LCA. My knowledge within that field and environmental management in general was definitely a part of being brought into that department where I started. However, it wasn't really part of any projects we did back then. So it was always something that I quite quickly learned that within a giant organization as that Ramboll is, within that there are like-minded individuals, and we had quite quickly we found each other, and we had this little group of like-minded individuals, if you will, that were trying to push this agenda into projects because we could immediately see the benefit for the client. We could see the value creation it would bring. And if you think about it, if you have to make a decision, you want to have as much information as possible when you're making information. So slowly but surely, we were able to incorporate this kind of thinking, this kind of carbon quantification in a meaningful way into the different projects. We tried early on to combine it as well with cost. But when I started back then, and it sounds like I'm really old now, and I just turned 40 yesterday though, but still, we didn't have that many available databases. We didn't have, definitely did not have InfoLCA or the national tools in the different countries that could guide us. So we kind of have to pick whatever was available and try and make it applicable. That was the challenge back then. But I mean, in an organization like Ramboll, who is very purpose-driven, there is a lot of people willing to go the extra mile and willing to incorporate new ways of thinking into the projects. And also, as you progress with this, you realize it's not a grand investment you need to do to work with decarbonization or quantify carbon, quantify cost. Think of it from a life cycle perspective. It's a different way of working, and therefore a challenge because we are messing with how people are normally working. We are messing with their rhythm, with their way of doing things. And as soon as you try to bring something new to the table, of course, that can be a little difficult, but in general, I think we are moving in the right direction. I will say, though, that in general in the market, the focus from the client, etc., it's not progressing as fast as I would personally want it to. But within the last year, for example, I have seen a much higher focus from our larger clients. I have seen implemented baselines coming in saying we have hardcore reduction targets based on meaningful baselines for the client. So all of a sudden you have a budget, of course, to work with, but you also have a carbon budget, if you will. So now there's this focus on how do we implement carbon quantification and utilize it for change. And that's really motivating. So I think that within this field, even 11 and a half years in, I'm still as motivated coming in every day as I was in the beginning.
Yeah, because you can have real impact here. And I would like certainly to go deeper into both topics. First, how your ecosystem of client and this is evolving, the structuration, the way forward, the targets are also evolving. So I will start with that, and we will come back a bit more on the difficulties on implementing change, bringing more, beyond your safety factor and beyond costs. What are the other dimensions that we are trying to bring to really be sustainable? Because sustainability is not, cost is part of it, but it's beyond that. It's certainly CO2, but also beyond CO2 and climate and so on. But within an organization, this need some adaptation measure to progress into that field. But first, if you agree to go on and continue on what you just explained, we observe some concrete changes in terms of structuration of the request, willingness to set up some reduction target from the road authorities and from the contractors themselves. How do you see this evolving? What is required to really progress even more? I mean, beyond target, we need also ways to reduce and ways to impact. So what's your feeling about next steps here? Because this is not stopping, accelerating actually. Yeah, what's this coming?
I think that there's quite a bit to jump into here, but first of all, if there is a requirement to do something in a project, then all of a sudden you have to do something. So you need to incorporate as an asset owner, infrastructure asset owner, you need to incorporate requirements in your project work. We see that with the Danish metro system, where they have a 50% reduction target based on what they built the last that was comparable. So by giving the project teams a baseline and saying, this is your budget, now cut 50% off of it in your embodied carbon from A1 to A5 within LCA calculations. And I'm assuming that our listeners are somewhat familiar with the life cycle phases of an LCA, and if not, I apologize. But the embodied carbon within this scope is where you need to find the reduction. And having that requirement, having that as a set goal, is of course forcing your project team to work on it, but it also shows support from top level in the organization, all the way down to project management, all the way down to the experts working on the projects. And by having an aligned goal, all of a sudden you're not this odd extra thing in the room, but you are an integral part of the project, and that makes a huge difference. So having requirements is key, and I would like to see some more from a Danish perspective. For example, the asset owners are typically the state in one way, shape, or form, and I think that they need to update their KPIs a little bit, because their KPIs are typically time. Can we do it within a specific time frame? And can we do it within a specific budget? Of course, it's very important to keep a keen eye on the budget and make sure you don't overpay for things. And we are not challenging that at all, but we are challenging the way of thinking about building infrastructure a little bit. And we definitely would like to see some KPIs that goes beyond just time and money.
And if I may also bounce on that, I have also a feeling that there was a strong push on reporting, carbon reporting, from what you've built and setting up some target on the build stage. But more and more moving towards a design stage where we need to take the best decision at this stage, which is involving obviously engineers and Ramboll teams as you are, but any engineers into that field. And one big challenge at this stage is that the level of accessibility to exact information are low. Uncertainty is still quite high, but you need to provide a way for engineers to compare solutions together and apple to apple, as you said. So here there are multiple challenges. Consistency, what are the choice I'm doing regarding the data, and the scope in itself. Should I focus first on what I can control, or the whole life cycle, or how do you manage that? So yeah, just having your feedback on the role of designers to impact the reduction of infrastructure emissions.
I think that the role of the designer is the most important one. I think that somebody like me, who can't build a single thing that I would want other people to walk on or drive on anyway, the designers and the experts are the ones that can make a difference. So I need to make sure, companies needs to make sure, project organizations needs to make sure that you have the tools available to compare designs whenever you're working on your projects. And I think the reason that one of the issues with the KPIs I mentioned earlier are that if the only focus has been time and money, then nobody has really looked at, is the design as optimized as it can be, and is there time enough to do the most optimized design? And we did a study for the Danish road directorate, who owns, who are responsible for constructing and maintaining most infrastructure here in Denmark, at least related to roads and bridges, highway bridges, etc. They were concerned about the highway bridges, and they thought, I wonder if we have the most optimal design. So they hired Ramboll to take a look at this, and it turned out that in some of the designs they had, and the ones we looked at 10 different variations, quite a few of them offered a significant resource, optimization. There were actually more than 40% too much embodied carbon, 40% too many resources utilized in the design. And the reason for that is that they knew exactly how long it would take to build it. They knew exactly what it would cost, so it was easy to budget. And that was all that matters. So we see that even though every time you work on a project, you design optimize to a certain degree within the parameters that you have, which is how much time do you have, what kind of budget do you have to do this work. Of course, you design optimize it, always developing a little bit, but we believe strongly that there is quite a bit potential here to reduce the initial consumption of resources. We believe that there is a lot to achieve here.
And so, a bit more concretely, what would be the approach within your team and transport team to deploy new ways of working to really include and consider these emissions as one of the factors of optimization into the design process?
So specifically for our engineers, whenever they work, they typically do it in some sort of in the BIM world. They use whatever kind of software to design whatever kind of asset they're building. And we are implementing a process where we want to make it as easy as possible, which is also why I think it's no secret that Ramboll works very closely together with Oris, and we utilize Oris as our go-to LCA tool when there's not a specific requirement otherwise. Oris is our go-to tool for our engineers, especially because it comes with a BIM connection. So we are implementing a new way for our engineers to work where, as an expert, you start your design, then you can upload your initial BIM file into Oris, which is the tool that we've chosen to use. And you can get a BIM viewer, you can get a quick understanding of your carbon footprint, which materials, which part of the design is the most CO2 heavy. We can even look at the cost of the different components if we have that information available. And then that feedback then goes back very quickly to the experts who can then see, okay, this is where I'm looking now. And then they can work towards a low carbon design based on this. So we believe that this constant feedback of how is my model performing, how is my design performing, where is the CO2 located, as long as they get that feedback back and forth, we think that can definitely utilize or speed up the process of more, carbon-friendly designs here. And that's a big change, because typically when you work with your BIM model, you don't have this extra step. You definitely did not have this option before. So we are implementing something new that our experts are not used to working with, so that we have, of course, taken that into account. So we have training into how should you utilize the Oris, how should you utilize whatever tool you're using here, and how can you implement it. And then the work doesn't just stop there. Whenever we identify excellent solutions, we want to broadcast them within our own organization, but also probably within the market in general. I think it's part of why we are also engaged in FIDIC. I know we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but we want to share the good experiences. We want to show how you can work meaningfully with decarbonization, and that when you have the process and tools in place, that it doesn't add a lot of extra cost to a project to start working with this. Of course, if you want to be very specialized within a design or optimize it as much as possible, it's going to require a little bit more time from an expert or an engineer, of course. But in general, when you start quantifying it, it gives a great benefit to the project. And we typically say if you can quantify it, you can act on it.
Yeah, and one of the really key elements in what you're implementing, and that I like and believe really much, is that you, for some time and for some people, sustainability is something that is worked on as a reporting capability or an independent step that say, okay, what's your CO2? Here you give this information directly to the designer. So that's the designer role to take this into consideration. And I think that's providing also value to them, to giving them the capability to really impact and reduce the carbon emissions. So that's a big change as well, to provide this value to the designers themselves. And of course, one of the key elements that we discussed here is also that if, as a designer, I'm doing the calculation on my side and someone else is doing its calculation, we get to the same results, and we provide the same decision in terms of what's the best solution for my design. What I mean, Ramboll is a global organization, and what's your approach to ensure also that even though we are applying consistent methodology, and you can also answer with the right data sets for the right customer, and being compliant with all these country rules or specific customer rules. What's the strategy here?
So definitely part of my responsibility in my day-to-day work here is to promote our decarbonization work, not just in Denmark, of course, but in all the countries where we are present. And as you say, we are a big organization. I think I mentioned we are close to 4,000 employees in transport, and close to 19,000 globally here. What we try to do is to have local leads. We have somebody like me who can assist in the different markets as needed, but we really want to anchor it locally. And the reason for that is that every country will have different specific ways of calculating CO2 from an infrastructure perspective, or different references to databases. In the Nordics, for example, every Nordic country has their own tool with their own nationally specific database. In Germany, they are looking into eco-invent as a general way of calculating it. They are used to working with EPDs, environmental product declarations. Other countries, that is not as specific as this. So every country has their own carbon maturity and own reference. So that's why we need local leads that can identify those and make sure that the process that we are promoting for working with decarbonization includes the local requirements. And that is a huge task. I mean, we are in the midst of identifying all of this. And I mean, this whole podcast and this way of talking here is not a plug for Oris, but you and I both know, working together closely, that making sure that we have all these different databases available is and identified, and then make them available for our colleagues, and then make sure we can train them, is quite the task. So again, we are very fortunate to have a partner and a tool where we can look to and say we have every national identified requirement implemented, and we can utilize it. We can even make sure that when a colleague logs in, that they start on this, because if they start using something that is not relevant, it doesn't speak to the client. So you have to make sure that it's client relevant and client specific.
Thank you, Andreas. I would like also to emphasize on the fact that you are part of the group of the carbon management framework at FIDIC, to also collaborate with other engineering firms and define an approach to it from an engineering perspective. So could you just give us some insight on the role, or is it going forward? What do you stand here?
Yeah, I think I, without a doubt, can say that it has been one of the more rewarding tasks I've had in my career, or some of my more rewarding work. FIDIC as an organization is very inspiring, and I have been fortunate enough to be part of a working group where we want to implement the carbon management framework, where we are focusing on ensuring that carbon management is part of the way that you work on projects that live up to the FIDIC requirements. And so we have a very broad working group with a lot of experts, and I'm just a small cog in the wheel here, but it has been, you can see the impact that such a change can have. If the overall goal for me have been to change something on projects, to actually make sure that change would happen. And for that to truly be implemented, you need to start out a little bit small. And the first goal for this carbon management framework is to get projects active in their carbon management. So we wanted to quantify their initial carbon footprint as early as possible, so that this carbon understanding can be part of the way that they work. And then the next level for this, and then you can kind of say, if you quantify and you have a carbon understanding, you are living up to the level 1 in the carbon management framework, which is 3 to 4 levels, if you will. The fourth one is very organizational, but there's 3 levels for a project work. And the reason for just starting to quantify it is, again, as I said earlier, if you can quantify it, you can act on it. And the hope is that by quantifying your footprint, you can identify areas where you can design optimize, where you can lower your initial resource consumption and not create a problem down the line because you're doing it wrong, but keeping the holistic view on it, understanding your carbon footprint, reducing your carbon footprint, especially as soon as possible in this, kind of the dire times that we are living in right now, where change needs to happen sooner rather than later. Reducing it up front, I think, is really important. So, in short, the carbon management framework is aiming to introduce carbon quantification and low-hanging fruit reduction, and then systematic reduction within your project, if you will, if I have to summarize it very quickly.
Yeah, and so what you've achieved with this group, I think, which is quite important, is how do we map a transformation to not bring a couple of experts in every team, but move the industry into something different. And in this change management, we need to expose everyone, engineers, to the carbon value first. Once they are exposed, we gain maturity, and with this new maturity, we have multiple, capability to have an impact. But to get there, you're not starting by providing a complex process to cover everything, but let's go step by step, depending on your maturity level. I think that's a key and really smart framework to really embed and engage everyone in the infrastructure industry here.
I can maybe add that we were just in Cape Town here in September, launching it. And I think the main message from us here were that you don't need a specific tool or a specific database. You need to make sure that you're utilizing something that makes sense in whatever geography your project is placed in. But you don't need a specific investment to start quantifying your CO2 footprint. There are plenty of free tools for that can give you a rough idea. And having a rough idea about where your project is, how your project's footprint is, and understanding, within your project where the most important areas for reduction can be the perfect start for your journey towards a more carbon-friendly project, if you will. So having that within the carbon management framework, we were basically made a document with signposting to the best possible solutions out there, or how you identify, how do you even start. We have a step-by-step guide We have a tool in there as well that will map out your project or your organization's carbon maturity. So you understand which areas do you need to improve on to implement this. I think that if we can kickstart that kind of quantification globally, we can really make a difference.
No doubt. And I think it's the good thing is also quite specific to the infrastructure ecosystem. Yeah, I mean, you spoke about the car industry, and car industry have this own principle and approach. I think infrastructure is also needed its own. You have multiple specialties within Ramboll. Buildings have their own approach to carbon management, and you've identified that this is not applicable to infrastructure, and we need something specific. What makes the biggest difference in your perspective?
I think that I have also been engaged in the building industry a little bit in my time here in Ramboll, and what we see a lot with buildings, especially in the Nordics, but also in the West in general, if you will, is that they can be that kind of building construction can be very certification driven, and we don't see the same certification focus, for example, within infrastructure. Within products, there are very different certain certifications. Within buildings, we see building certifications. Within infrastructure, there's not so many certifications, and there are not so many certifications that exist, and it's not sought after by the asset owners in the same way. I think BREEAM infrastructure is a brilliant certification in general, and I really think the systematic approach that it implements is very useful, but it's not something that the asset owners are willing to pay for. So we need to have other ways of implementing this kind of requirements, as I spoke about earlier. If the certification is bringing into those requirements, if that's not existing in your infrastructure project, which I will almost guarantee you it's not, then we need requirements from other places. And that's where, for example, the work we're doing within FIDIC, within the carbon management framework, can be a guideline and can help with adding the right requirements to the projects. Make sure you do your quantifications, but also make sure you don't do it at the end of the project. You have to do it as early as possible, so you get an early understanding of how is it my carbon footprint look like, and that way you have more opportunity to actually do something about it and reduce it. And I think one of the things that our clients in general are now realizing is that when we talk about reducing your carbon footprint in your early design phases, we are talking about using less resources. We're talking about optimizing the design. And typically, that should come with a reduction in cost for the client, for the benefit of the client. They don't have to buy so many materials to construct their project. And that is definitely some of the earlier conclusions we are seeing from the asset owners that we do work for within the decarbonization framework here. Of course, it's not every project that can be guaranteed, but there is most likely always something that can be optimized. So I think carbon reductions, resource consumptions goes hand in hand with cost reduction. And that's just one of the ways that this kind of work brings value to the asset owners.
So what you expect, and you've demonstrated probably already, is that on some project, when you focus on carbon, you have also an impact on cost. So return on investment is 100% positive. Is this something that is already understood, you think, by your customer?
I think that some of our clients definitely have that understanding. I think the Danish Metro company is a great example of somebody who is really embracing this way of thinking. And I think others, to other clients, it might still think of sustainability or CO2 quantification or something like that as being, more of a documentation requirement than something that can actually bring value to a project. But I think we all have a pretty good understanding, or will at least in the future have an understanding of the resource scarcity the problems related to resource scarcity that we are looking into. In Denmark, it's very critical. We don't have enough gravel and sand for concrete production to even have enough for the projects that are planned towards 2035. So it's a real issue that we currently are facing, and where we don't have the local resources, you would have to buy it elsewhere and import it, which comes at a much higher cost than what we're used to. So I think just from a financial perspective, design optimization, resource reduction is going to have to be something we all have to take very seriously. And that when it goes hand in hand with carbon reduction, that makes me happy. But I think it's a very important way of thinking and a very important decision parameter.
And it's our role as engineer to anticipate on all that.
Absolutely. I would maybe add that it's my role as a decarbonization lead to make sure that the real experts, the engineers working on these projects daily, have the right tools and have the right processes and understanding in place so that they can work with design optimization. Because the only ones who can do something about this are the real experts and engineers out there.
So one of the key elements to increase this awareness is also to have internal communication on these carbon targets, on this carbon footprint of the different designs. So what's your ideal, perspective on that? What do you want to build on, to communicate internally, to also set up the new target, really to deploy this strategy?
I think when we internally in Ramboll, at least, we are very focused on implementing this kind of examples into our daily understanding of what does decarbonization look like within a certain area of expertise. So we will be working on having relevant examples for each of our departments, for example, so that if you're working with maintaining bridges, we'll have some scenarios and examples with calculations ready to present to the experts and saying, this is what it could look like within your area of expertise. Or if we have it with construction of road, it looks different. With harpers, it looks different. But I think it's important that we make it as relevant as possible for the daily tasks that our experts have. So that's just within Ramboll. And then externally, we are trying to do the same for our clients, to showcase to them what does decarbonization look like for you as an organization, and maybe even specifically for you as an organization, if it's within bridges, if it's within roads, etc., so that there is a very easy to understand examples of how is it that we are working with carbon management. What kind of areas do we expect you can find reductions based on our expertise as a global consultant company. Other times we will work closely together with the client to investigate where are the areas of potentials for them specifically, and then that's going to be our. But keeping it as relevant as possible, I think, is key, because we have all seen these different examples, different presentations where there's a cool example, but it's so far-fetched from your everyday life that it doesn't really, it's hard to connect, the design optimization of a highway in Japan with my day-to-day work with the small bridges in a small city in Copenhagen, for example. So it has to be as close as possible whenever that is possible. So that is definitely the goal. And then the second part of making sure that happens is that we have experts available to assist our own colleagues, and we are also trying to make sure that we can assist our clients in whatever shape and form that they need. And sometimes they're not 100% sure what they need, and then we offer kind of small bite sizes saying, let's try a week of this, let's try 2 days where we're doing something like this, so they don't have to commit to a huge investment. We like to do it step by step, small investments, building on experience, and that way, they don't have to overcommit to something that is not relevant to them. And it's I think it's the best way of doing it, because then you identify quite quickly where are the areas of potentials and what is their carbon maturity, and then we go from there. I think that's the best way.
Yeah, and you said it. I mean, if you're able in a couple of days to demonstrate, I mean, you talk about 40% carbon reduction on some cases for simple bridges that are something that any engineers in the team could have designed, because this is a safe design. This is working, but there is another option. So we need also to encourage them to find better options, or build up some alternative design options in which they can find themselves the right approach to reduce carbon. So all this is really, at first at least, accompanying the engineers, providing the options and solutions, but quickly get the understanding and the awareness, and demonstrate significant impact. And that's what's most important in what you said, I think, is that anyone in his daily job, in engineers, could have significant impact when we speak about carbon emissions. And that's achievable without so many hours of involvement. Just changing a bit and having some understanding on what you measure and express. What would you then recommend to anyone that can listen to us, from working for an engineering firms or contractors, or anyone that wants to make an impact in his team, in his next project? So what would be the great way forward for your experience, or from where you stand?
I think the first thing I always say is that when you start working with this, you quite quickly realize it's not rocket science. It is not as difficult as it looks like, if you have a good systematic way of working with this. So you can utilize almost any tool, any database, to start getting an understanding of your footprint. And I think building that understanding is the best way to start. So if you're starting out completely from scratch, depending a little bit where you are in the world, but I would say the carbon management framework from FIDIC, which is already online, is a fantastic place to start. There's all this signposting as to how you do it. There's even a step-by-step guide where you can, if you follow it, you should be able to get a first understanding of your carbon footprint. You can get the first quantification of your carbon footprint, and therefore start building this carbon maturity within your own thought process, but also within your team's process, within your organization's focus on this. So by building carbon maturity, you will quickly realize that being able to have a carbon quantification as part of your decision making can be really, really powerful. And I will quickly add that the most sustainable project might not be the one with the lowest CO2 footprint, but it is really important to have the CO2 calculation as part of your decision parameters, because if you don't quantify it, you have a really hard time understanding what the differences are and what you can and cannot do, and you keep having this feeling-based idea about what is it that truly matters in your project. And I think it sounds a little bit cheesy, but going from feelings to facts, I think that is really beneficial. It's much easier to make informed decisions when you have some different parameters in place to support you.
Yeah, building up these fact sheets or library of projects to start to consider what are typical benchmark in a specific region, what are the targets, and decide that, I mean, we need to go towards zero. That's what you said in introduction as well. But on our way to zero, we need to go to minus 10%, minus 20, and so on, and define such target. Is it something that is existing already in your strategy?
Yes,
targets?
I think one of the things that we are very inspired to have is an experience-based database. That's also something that we are striving to have within the global regime within FIDIC. But within Ramboll, we also want to have just our own global experience-based database with projects, so that we first can start to, mostly for communication purposes, but can start to understand how does our projects perform compared to one another. Are they high per whatever unit you're looking at? Are they low? Are they right in the middle? But I think the most important potential with this is to first understand how your project performs, if you need that for motivation, but sharing the solutions to help lower your carbon footprint within certain types of projects. So, for example, what is the best thing you can do for bridges in general? What is the best thing you can do for bridges in Denmark? All of a sudden we go from something that is completely generic down to something that can be very projects relevant in in the specific region you're doing your project. So that could be Denmark, could be Norway, could be Singapore, could be Canada, but just having something that is applicable locally, and through this experience-based database, sharing the way of working, sharing the good solutions. I think that is that can be a very powerful tool, because then no matter which colleague picks it up, starting to work on this, they can be guided towards something that potentially can have a huge impact on their project. And I think we all know that it's hard to knowledge share, and it's even harder to knowledge share in a large organization. So if you can kind of assist that, I think that is a very good supporting tool to have.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Andreas, for sharing all that and this experience and the ambition. Maybe one last question. But in this transformation, what do we see that? What do you foresee as having big impact and activate this transformation in the months, years to come? Maybe.
I just returned from vacation, and I think that I spent a little bit too much time thinking about work, as you sometimes do. But sometimes when you're not forced to do it, some of the more enlightened thoughts, maybe like, you get an epiphany or something else. And I'm not sure I'm quite at that level yet, but I keep thinking about the possibility of standardizing your work, like the AI assistance that we can get. I think that if we utilize some of this kind of automation positively, smartly, it can help us a lot with our day-to-day engineering work. It already does, and I'm sure there's a lot of potentials that's not even unlocked yet. But implementing this solution where based on previous knowledge, based on experience, we can have a much better point of departure for our projects, so that I can, let's say I'm a bridge engineer, I start up my processes, I start up ORIS in this case, and then I tell them I want to build a bridge. I want to build a bridge that can do X, Y, and Z. It has these kind of parameters, and then based on the experience-based database, it will give me the best point of departure for designing such a bridge. That should free up a lot of time to work on specific updates, but it should also make sure that the best possible approaches are implemented. And then after we're done, I know you and I have already talked about this, but having some sort of automation for reporting, where it will spit out in a template, any shape or form that I wish for my organization in this type of project, so that I only have to focus on the very specific project-specific solutions. I think that will also revolutionize the way that we work as engineers and experts, and free up a lot of our mental capabilities, not doing the mundane, and that will take up a lot of time, but focus on the actual engineering side of the work, and then hopefully that will then leave room to push the boundaries even further. And I think that will create much better solutions moving forward. So having this kind of automation involved in our day-to-day life, I think that can revolutionize the way that we work within infrastructure in general.
I can certainly see that coming in the next few years, for sure, and increasing more and more this impact. As a conclusion, maybe what to complete, what should be the synthesis or an advice that we can give to people that are listening to us?
I think the best advice is just to get started. I think when you are working if you've worked within buildings or within some of those, that there's a very steep learning curve because the references are so specific. They're so driven by certifications. They're driven by very specific requirements to detailed calculations. If you work with LCA before in a product capability, you realize that is not something that is so easy to do. There is a lot of details. But when it comes to projects in general, when it comes to building your enhancing your carbon maturity, just starting to quantify your project's footprint, getting this understanding of where is it that the largest CO2 emissions are embodied, and start to think about how can I reduce this within this field. What can I implement as substitute material? Is it overly engineered? Is it living up to some outdated safety requirements? Like starting to think in solutions within this area here, I think can be a great way to start. Just start, just quantify it, use it, and then build on it from there.
Fantastic. I like it. Just start, do it, measure, and you will find 40% somewhere that you can get.
Easy.
Easily. Thanks a lot, Andreas, for the deep exchange and recognizing also as everything you said and shared how this decarbonization transformation is on its way, and is also thanks to people like you that are impacting their teams and their companies. So thanks a lot for sharing, and looking forward to see you soon.
Thank you very much for having me.